Testing 1, 2, 3. Right, we're now live with this broadcast coming from rural Sweden up on Hallandsåsen. My name's Roger Lewis. I blog as Longhead Musings these days. I used to blog under Let Them Confect Sweeter Lies, and that was on Blogger. I now blog on WordPress. That was the test. This is the studio screen for the YouTube platform for live streaming, and it looks like we're all good to go. So let's dive in. Here's my blog, Roger's Longhead blog, and this latest blog is a reblog of a post about Greta Thunberg, a Swedish student from Stockholm who has garnered rather a lot of publicity for going on what's called a climate strike, and a call for action against what Greta calls the climate crisis. This reblog actually reframes this concept of a climate crisis, which certain people in the field of science don't, when it's unpacked, actually agree that there's a climate crisis in the sense which Greta means it, or appears to mean it. I'm an environmentalist, and I think there's an environmental crisis. I think there are other crises in our political economy and so forth, and there's certainly a crisis in science education, and there is certainly a crisis in critical thought and criticism of what we refer demurely to as experts, or let the experts get on with it. The neoliberal slogan of there is no alternative, this idea that there's one true way. What there is a climate belief system rather than a scientific basis upon which to base climate beliefs around anthropogenic global warming. Unpacking that, it usually is used to refer to emissions of carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels, and leaping from there to saying that the warming that has been observed in average world temperatures over the period they've been extensively monitored, and depending where you look at, the warming to date is claimed to be around 0.8 degrees. So what this broadcast is about is to unpack that and to challenge this notion of settled science, this notion that 97% of accredited science experts agree that man-made CO2 emissions are causing a climate crisis. It's presented in various forms, but we'll go along. I think I've made the point of where I'm coming here. Just a word on discourse, a word on discussion. I fully support Greta's freedom of speech, and I admire the guts it takes to stand up in front of an audience and give a talk about something which is of great concern. And I also agree that the grown-ups aren't listening. I also agree that government action as it is described on the tin or on the packaging, does not point to any belief that there is actually any sort of crisis. The crisis which I will develop an argument for is actually in the monetary system and the debt-based monetary system, creation of private credit for private profit at interest, and I will through this talk develop a conjecture that's where the crisis stems from, and if we're going to solve this environmental crisis and this crisis in a political economy, what we need to do is look at the science, understand the science, and start applying those scientific methods and those ways of ordering our thoughts and making our ideas clear in such a way that spin, propaganda, narratives, mainstream media, sensationalization, news infotainment, and all of those things which are misleading and masking and acting a bit as a beard against what the real problems are, who the real people are that are bearing the cost for the excesses of our corrupt political leadership, and so we'll move on from here. So this is another very good blog which actually contrasts how Greta's message has been taken on by corporate messaging and narrative people, and it compares it to Bana Alabed, who was a blogger, Twitter person who reported on the Syrian conflict. And the Syrian conflict is something that has suffered a similar sort of spin fest to the environmental crisis and the problem which is faced in terms of political economy and environmental matters regarding countries in the Washington Consensus and the global south subsidising effectively lifestyles in the northern hemisphere with their resources, for which a whole ton of debt is visited upon them under the idea that this will somehow set them free from their poverty. And there is countless evidence and research in the academic literature which shows that debt acts as a funnel for the wealth of resource-rich countries. Having oil discovered can be a curse, often is. There's a very good report called Drilling into Debt which looked into that. I think it was in the early 1990s. I'll put a link in the description. So moving on to my next slide here. So Greta came into my consciousness really from this blog by Clive Law, and Clive was a founding member of the Ecology Party as it was then, which became the Green Party of England and Wales. And Clive is interested in something called the tragedy of the commons, and he's also into the work of Elinor Ostrom, who's an environmental economist, and he sees signs of Elinor's work in Kate Raworth's work, and Kate wrote a book called Donut Economics. Now, in fact, Kate did a tweet today saying, "Don't play Monopoly, play this other game," which struck me as being a rather odd thing to do, because if you understand the let's just get this up when the point is fresh in There we are, this one here, look. Pandemic, this new game. What's more, it will equip you with the very 21st century skill of collaboration. Well, what Monopoly was about and the history of Monopoly, I actually tweeted in response to this. It looks like it may have disappeared. Yeah, it does. Saying the history of Monopoly is such that it was actually written to demonstrate how the economic system was rigged, and the person who invented it, it wasn't to teach people to be a capitalist, it was to show how crony capitalism and the robber barons in late 19th century USA were effectively swindling farmers out of their land. Now, it seems to me that Monopoly, if you understand what it is demonstrating, is a very, very good life lesson and a point which seemed to be missed on Ms. Raworth. But I digress. Anyway, Clive posted this and I responded to it. Effectively, I think Monbiot and people like Owen Jones are they're gatekeepers as opposed to useful idiots for capitalism, and I'm sure they're quite sincere in many of their views, but they only give half of the story because they're actually blinded by their own belief systems and their own belief that they're actually right. I sent this video which I've posted a link to on Clive's thing here refers to a talk by Quilligan on finance and the commons, or finance as a commons, and Quilligan was a young researcher when the Brandt report came out, and the Brandt report is about the disparities between the rich global north and the poorer southern hemisphere, and this siphon of resources, and in repayment with usury, or in repayment with poverty, and it came up with ideas of how to have a money system that might, counter that. At around all the time that was happening, there was something which was the OPEC oil crisis, or the Nixon shock, and that's really where modern political economy and the huge growth of the industrial military complex really gets going. If one wants to understand the current crisis in capitalism, financialized capitalism, our political economy, and in our democracies, this is where they stem from, and something called petrodollar hegemony. Now, petro does refer to the distillate of crude oil, and the petrodollar is the currency standard by which all other fiat currencies, they're linked to it, and it's a very important mechanism in the American economy, and there are great problems stored up for the US economy and its oligarchy should people stop using the petrodollar. And this is something that happened in Iraq first with Saddam Hussein. That was his great crime, settling oil contracts in euro instead of US dollar. It's the Iranian great crime. It was Colonel Gaddafi's great crime in Libya. It is Assad's great crime in Syria, and going all the way back, with Mossadegh in Egypt, nationalising the Suez Canal and so forth. These are the things that concern our oligarch-sponsored politicians, not human rights and human rights abuses. The absurd contradictions are very clear. If you look at, say, Saudi Arabia and human rights in Saudi Arabia, and yet they're given a free rein to murder journalists, for instance, just a recent example. Also, this is why China and Russia are being demonized so greatly. Both of those countries have been building up their gold reserves and looking for a way through the BRICS Bank, which is now called the World Development Bank or some such, and that is getting away from using the SWIFT settlement of international credit movement, and also getting away from being doing trade in oil. So they're using trade in kind and building up their gold reserves. Now, I'm not a gold bug. I don't believe in hard money. I do think that Bernard Latier's Terra, T-E-R-R-A currency idea, Bernard died last week sadly, but his ideas on complementary currencies, he actually was the main driving force behind the development of the euro, by the way. But what his criticism of the euro, which you can find online, was that it was implemented without a political union in place, and he said it will never work if you don't do that, and they just ignored him. Now, this is a very similar thing to what happens at the IPCC, and all the great science, all the scientists at the IPCC are doing. I've read all of the IPCC reports, all of them, every word, and I've also read the summaries and the press releases, which bear virtually no relation to the science that is actually in them. And it's because of that that many of the lead authors have resigned over the years. Now, I produced a PDF which went over various of these things, but Dr. Jeffrey Glassman, who published something called the Rocket Science Journal, actually dealt with these issues in a very comprehensive manner, and I'm going to come to that a bit later in this talk. So this is where the interaction, sort of in the great sort of static of human communication, happened. Clive said, Greta Thunberg, I've tried to get her to say about my message, i.e. Clive's message about the tragedy of the commons and why isn't anyone doing anything and all this, and Montbiot doesn't get back to me, and the Green Party leadership don't take me seriously, and all this sort of thing. And my answer to Clive was, well, of course they don't, Clive. You actually make some sense, and you want to do something about it. But, you know, there isn't... Number one, with CO2 there isn't a problem, but number two, they don't want to do anything about the cause of concern to the rest of us. There's a different agenda here, and it's an agenda of what's called full spectrum dominance of a unipolar world, which comes from the Project for the New American Century. It comes from things, what they're now calling the rules-based international order, which is just a rehashing of what George Bush the First did actually call the New World Order. Now, again, something like that is, you can unpack a whole bunch of stuff out of something like the New World Order. What does it mean? In the sense that I mean it in the sense that Carol Quigley used a similar notion in Tragedy and Hope, and talked about how international finance and its power struggle with international capital in the terms of means of production, so large industries, if your business is the production of credit or production of debt, or your business is the production of widgets, there's a conflict between on the one hand, bankers want the value of their money to remain high, and for deflation is quite good for bankers because it makes their money worth more, whereas if you produce widgets, you want to produce your widgets at a profit, and you don't really want inflation, but you definitely don't want deflation, because your inventory becomes something of a liability. Now, it's a dynamic equation, and this is another thing about systems, is that they are dynamic, and dynamic chaotic systems are not something which we easily conceive of as humans, and we'll come to that in a little bit as well. So effectively, when I started drilling down, particularly into the Extinction Rebellion and looking at various things, I came across this this group who interviewed Greta. Let's just open this in another tag, and we'll just have a little listen, and I can tell you what I find so unsatisfactory.
World scientists' warning to humanity, a very, very powerful framing for what we face. But there were two of them. First, 1992, the Union of Concerned Scientists in America.
Right, now this guy's an ex-Wall Street guy that's got this platform going, and there are various videos that get done on this, and they publish various papers. And I've characterised them as some sort of death cult, and thought that Frank Zappa's song "Don't Eat Yellow Snow" was very funny in saying yellow snow Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid comes from a suicide cult and something called the Jonestown Massacre, and these people do talk in the language of a death cult. So this guy, Jem Bendell, this thing here is a narcissistic tour de force of utter claptrap. It's a stream of consciousness from of a thoroughly unsatisfactory source. My criticism of it is simple, but let's just do this quote from Zappa as it's here. "The illusion of freedom will continue as long as it's profitable to continue the illusion. At the point where the illusion becomes too expensive to maintain, they will just take down the scenery, they will pull back the curtains, they will move the tables and chairs out of the way, and you will see the brick wall at the back of the theatre." So that's redolent with all sorts of imagery, but for me the one that comes to mind immediately is the Wizard of Oz, and the wizard with the curtain, pulling back the curtain and all the levers and all the rest of it, and there's this funny little man, gnome-like man, who sort of says, "But I'm only doing what I think is right." So that's that. I'm just going to turn Skype off on my computer here. Away you go. There we are. So that's yeah. Don't drink the yellow snow. Right. So what have we got here? So here's this chap whose name I just really couldn't be bothered to remember, but there'll be links in the description. I mean, do have a listen. So anyway, I came then to do this this blog because I listened to that Jem Ben whatever he's called blog, and then there's a guy called Dr. Rupert Reed who posts on. My friend David Malone is a very much respected commentator on financial things on the Gollum X1V blog, but also is the maker of science documentaries. He and I will be publishing the script shortly, or in the not too distant, of his fantastic series Dangerous Knowledge, which is about the infinity in mathematics, and Boltzmann, Turing, Gödel, he doesn't do Tarski. But anyway, this Rupert Reed character actually posts a lot on David's Facebook feed, and so I decided to have a read of these two papers published in this IFLAS thing, which is to do with that guy in the video, and I read them, and well, they're really not up to passing muster, in my opinion. That intellectual rigour and those papers should not be mentioned in the same sentence. Anyway, so I did this blog, and that then sort of, you know, brought to the Rocket Science Journal and whatnot, and then Greta was criticised for her message being captured by these corporate groups surrounding it. And she's resigned from one of them, which is a Swedish startup, which I'd been doing a bit of drilling down into, and so I decided to look at the Wikipedia articles on these two things, and again I found that the lack of balance, you know, wasn't okay for me, and I've done a bit of editing, particularly on the Green Party leadership of 2016 and 2018. One in trying to get the endorsements that David Malone got into the discourse, and I was doing a similar thing for Shara Ali when he was accused of anti-Semitism, and so you can go on my Wikipedia editing and there'll be a link or whatever, and you can see what I had to say about those things, and now I'm involved in trying to get some balance on Greta's article, but also on the Extinction Rebellion article. The thing is with propaganda, if it's completely one-sided, it doesn't work anyway, and brainwashing then it becomes a thing, and people resist brainwashing. You know, propaganda has to be a bit more subtle. Not that I'm an advocate for propaganda, but you know, this is the thing. So anyway, my reasoning and why I say the things I say are set out in my blog in some detail. Now, concision. This is not going to be a short video, obviously, but on concision in manufacturing of consent, there's a very interesting segment of Noam Chomsky being asked why he's never on Nightline, which is a half-hour talk show that used to be, for all I know, still is quite popular in the United States. And the guy that produced it said, we can't have Chomsky on because he takes too long explaining things. And Noam Chomsky responded to that, saying, if I say something that isn't in the general discourse and easily indexed by people, it takes a bit more time to unpack it. So if you say something that isn't in the script, as it were, people will get very offended very quickly if you don't explain yourself. And he explains this in Manufacturing of Consent, and it's worth taking a look at that and seeing how easy it is then to shut down speech, which then of course then takes us to, well, Greta has this platform on a TED Talk and gets to say her piece. And so it is a valid question to say, why is Greta allowed to say what she's saying? Is it because it's such a powerful insight that no one else has had? There are some of that in it. But is it that there are aspects in which Greta is making her presentation for which she is complementing a narrative which the larger media powers want to push? And they can emphasise even the areas which are mistaken or perhaps not as thoroughly researched as they could be. And in a 12-minute talk, there's only so much that you can actually get across. And you can make an appeal to emotion much more easily in a polemic than you can in a reasoned argument, which again we'll come on to shortly. And then this series of 5 articles came out, which is entitled "The Manufacturing of Greta Thunberg for Consent, the Political Economy of the Non-Profit Industrial Complex." Now this is NGOs, and the whole gamut here then opens up to the way that narratives are presented as being objective and presented as being independent, reasoned and reasonable, when actually they aren't anything of the sort. And this is where you have oil companies writing legislation about safety. This is where you have fracking companies writing legislation about fracking. It's where you have the committees of experts that adjudicate on legal disputes between global corporations and regional governments. And they don't have to use the courts that everybody else has to use. So it's institutionalizing the fixing of the rules in favour of already incredibly powerful and very strong institutions, corporations, and so forth. And that's what this series kind of gets at. I don't read these as a criticism of Greta. I think Greta's great, and I'm really pleased she's doing it. And all the people going on the process, I say, stand loud and proud, and let them have it. You should be pissed off. That famous film Network, where the guy says, "I'm mad as hell," and then they all start yelling out the window. You should be mad as hell. In our guts we know there's something not quite right here, right? But it's not a climate crisis, okay? That isn't what it is. There's an environmental crisis which has a different complexion and a different set of problems and things that need solving. So the tar sands, for instance, that's one environmental problem. Overfishing, that's another environmental problem. Using the open seas as an open sewer, sluicing oil tanks in the oceans, whaling, it goes on, fracking, what are the other, deforestation, there's a big one. Now this blog, The Wrong Kind of Green, is an Indigenous peoples blog, and so it's things like the genocide of Indigenous Indians in the Amazonian rainforests. Now Sting has had something to say about that. When he was getting really too near to the bone and cutting it down there were smears against Sting, and it appeals to the green eye of human nature. I'm a musician. I'm nothing the sort of musician that Sting is, but of course, you kind of have this thing. They're giving him a hard time, and there's part of you that quite enjoys that, and so it makes the job easier for the smearer to smear. But as I say, Sting got smeared for actually saying, "Hold on a second, you're chopping down where these people live. What right have you got to do that?" There are lots of instances of that all over the world. So I'm not cherry picking or favouritising or sort of saying, well, this is more important than that. It's all important, okay? And CO2 emissions, they are important, not because they change climate, but because where they come from, why they come from there, and what makes oil favoured for subsidies over, say, other forms of power generation. Now, energy is basically the source of all of our modern comforts. Not money. Money is an abstract oh, it's what the famous linguist Quine called a convenient posit, which is basically something that stands in between the idea of a thing and a thing in itself. It's like a place marker, and that's what money is. It's an IOU. So if you look at Quine's paper, the twin dogmas, or the two dogmas of empiricism, this is where he coins this phrase about convenient posits. If you have a look at that, you'll see what he's getting at. And what he also says is that as a lay physicist, he believes in the scientific method and not in the gods of Homer. Well, climate crisis is in the category of the gods of Homer and metaphysics, okay? And scientific rigour and proper scientific modelling, which Jeffrey Glassman talks about, is in the realm of rational logical science. Now, I'm a poet, so I you know, appealing to the emotions, having a word picture paint 1,000 words, all of that stuff, you know, I get that, I do get that, and you know, being in touch with our emotional side, I get that too. I mean, I'm a Pelagian when it comes to theology, and not. I don't follow the teachings of Augustine, for instance. Pelagius was basically thrown out of the church and persecuted for being a heretic. What is a heretic? So on heretics, Rupert Sheldrake and his TED Talk, which is known as the banned TED Talk, he wrote a book called The Science Delusion, which is a pun on Dawkins' The God Delusion. Rupert lists, I think it's 20 dogmas of materialist scientism as opposed to science. So just because something pretends to be science or presents itself as being all scientific, okay, it's not necessarily so. So just one last point on that little thread. In the field of knowledge and in study, we've become very, very, very focused down to fine-grained detail and experts. The best example of this that I've heard, that there's a copy of the talk on my YouTube channel of the BBC science editor James Berg. He made a famous scientific series called Connections, and James is being interviewed, and he's talking about his computer engine, which was to be known as Knowledge Doc. And he talks about specialisation, and what he says is that one of his friends actually got a doctorate on the use of the possessive apostrophe in the writing of, for argument's sake, it was some contemporary writer, and this guy got a doctorate for that. Now, in Polanyi's famous essay, the what's it called now, of science, the anyway, Polanyi wrote this this essay, which Judith Curry quoted from, which is to do what's it called, DD of science. Goodness me, come on, Lewis. I'm just going to get a little bit of help from my blog here, because what I can do, you see, this is a good thing of having a blog. Right. Oh, I've got it. It's the Republic of Science. The Republic of Science. That's what the essay is called. It was around 1967. And Polanyi talks about how experts know a lot about very little. And then the other point then is there's this thing called a dilettante who knows lots and lots of little things, maybe lots of quotes or very, very superficial stuff, basically bullshitters. But there's also a thing called a polymath, and a polymath is someone that gets involved in really getting into some of the fine-grained detail, but joining it up across fields. And what James Burke's point is, in the Connection series and all the rest of it, is that where discoveries tend to get made in science and technology and all the rest of it is at the boundaries of different fields, where people think outside of the box, and thinking outside of the box. And that is something which spin doctors aren't really into. What they try to do is get people into boxes, preferably into separate opposing boxes, and get them hating on each other. And that generates a great deal of heat and not very much light. So that's the point I wanted to make there. And so then that then comes to this just fantastic blog on Steemit, which is on the distributed web. Web3 is a big thing. I'm a programmer of this sort of thing. I'm into smart contracts and Ethereum and what have you, and the International Planetary File System. But Francis Leader is an environmental activist, and Francis Leader says here, look, there isn't a climate crisis per se. And I like Sam the blogger, she's got there. This is basically a blog about infiltrations of the fracking protests. Has she got the graph in this one? No, it must have been another one of them. But anyway, this is a really, really good blog, which is well worth reading. And I'll put the reference to the thing with the graph in, but we'll get on to some graphs in a minute from the peerless Dr. Glassman. Right, so at this point in my talk, I'm going to read you a poem. It's not one of mine, it's by Lao Tzu. Back in 2011, I moved to Sweden in 2010. I got very deeply into probability theory and the statistical modelling of natural phenomena. And this is actually a GIF, which is a model of the decay of a radioactive isotope. But this poem, which I got from an essay that Alan Watts wrote, is really quite amazing. I'm going to read it now. Why scurry about looking for the truth? It vibrates in everything and every not thing, right off the tip of your nose. Can you be still and see it in the mountain, the pine tree, yourself? Don't imagine that you'll discover it by accumulating more knowledge. Knowledge creates doubt, and doubt makes you ravenous for more knowledge. You can't get full eating that way. The wise person dines on something more subtle. He eats the understanding that the named was born from the unnamed, that all being flows from non-being, that the describable world emanates from an indescribable source. He finds this subtle truth inside his own self and becomes completely content. So who can be still and watch the chess game of the world? The foolish are always making impulsive moves, but the wise know that victory and defeat are decided by something more subtle. They see that something perfect exists before any move is made. This subtle perfection deteriorates when artificial actions are taken. So be content not to disturb the peace. Remain quiet. Discover the harmony in your own being. Embrace it. If you can do this, you will gain everything, and the world will become healthy again. If you can't, you will be lost in the shadows forever. Lao Tzu. That's a very profound poem. I love that poem. Now, what have we got there? Now this is a word tag, and I've put that further down there to deal with, so I'm going to close that. This is the blog of the World's People Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth. Now, this is out of Bolivia. It's out of the non-aligned. What was the word? It was 21st century socialism, the revival in South America. There's Eva Morales there, and various. This conference produced the People's Charter, which is what the Wrong Kind of Green takes its inspiration and guidance from. This is what they stand for. So that's why that's there. Then we come to this one, which I've left this here to read the Who We Are, because it is really rather funny. And Samizdatta may be something you've never heard of, but it's one of the top websites. I did a blog about how big the web is and how concentrated it is at the very top. Therefore, how controlled the narratives which come to us really are. And Samizdatta somehow is up there. But I'm just going to read this, which just made me laugh. What happened there? There we are. Right. The Samizdatta people are a bunch of sinister and heavily armed globalist Illuminati who seek to infect the entire world with the values of personal liberty and several property. Amongst our many crimes is a sense of humour and the intermittent use of British spelling. We're also a varied group made up of, now there we are, I can see that now, made up of social individualists, classical liberals, Whigs, libertarians, extrapians, futurists, porcupines, Karl Popper fetishists, recovering neoconservatives, crazed Ayn Rand worshippers, over-caffeinated Virginia Postrel devotees, witty Frederick Bastiat wannabes, cypherpunks, minarchists, criticists, and wild-eyed anarcho-capitalists from Britain, North America, Australia and Europe. And that made me laugh, because and yet they all exist here having this wonderful discourse. The reason I got that up on my screen, because I don't read it, when I discovered it, I delved into it about several years ago. I wanted to see if they had anything about Greta or anything like that, and I don't know if there is anything on there, but their search box certainly didn't reveal any of it to me. But I thought I'd put it up there because other people may find that more interesting than I do. Why are we here? This is I mentioned David earlier, and he one of his more recent documentaries is a film series called Why Are We Here on Curiosity Stream. So check it out. Man's Place in the Universe. This is Alan Watts, where that poem, which I just read, came from. Very interesting essay, very well worth the read. And now we come to Jeffrey Glassman and his talk, Science and Skepticism. Now, the MP3 is downloadable from this site. as are the slides from the presentation, but no one had put them together. So I actually did put the slides in time to the video as best I could, which turned out to be a greater endeavour than I thought it would be, but it's up there now on the YouTube channel, and when I do the blog of this talk, it will be there too. And before the next bit of this talk now, it would be worth watching it, because I'm going to skip over some of the concepts which Jeff goes over, and the Rocket Science Journal will be in the comments as well. And again, Jeff Glassman's acquittal of CO2 paper has not been rebutted, and you'll find, if you look on Science, Skeptical Science or DSmog blog, there are some individuals who aren't given the full smear treatment. I mean, I may be wrong, but I have had a check, and I could only find 3 references to Jeff Glassman in one obscure comments thread. People like Lord Monckton of Branchley, they go full on against my lord, but I like Monckton, and I think his work stands up. And his latest, the very last paper that he's put out with Willie Soon, etc., is very, very good, and it does touch on the fast Fourier transform, and more of which later, perhaps. So anyway, look, before I do this segment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a song. Okay, and I'm just going to resume. I'm going to have a cigarette break for 10 minutes. So let's put on a song. And the song I've got for you now is not one of my own. That's one of my own. It's this one. I love this song.
Place to play. You said that you've never been, but all the things that you've seen
This is Huawei Mate 20 Pro, the greatest smartphone we've ever created. With the intelligent camera, powerful processor, and a strong battery. Tested by the experts.
Waterproof! Tested!
Face recognition. Awesome!
Macro mode. Nice.
It's dead. It's dead.
Not on my watch. Reverse wireless charging.
Image stabilization tested!
It's just you and me for 2 days. Powerful battery.
Night mode.
And how would you test Huawei Mate 20 Pro?
The world has tested. Now it's your turn.
I'm back. Sorry to interrupt David Gilmour there. 32 million views, and quite right too. Fantastic song, Comfortably Numb. Well, hopefully you're not comfortably numb at this this stage of the talk without musical intermission. Meanwhile, back in Halland-Sausen, let's get back to where we were up to. Jeffrey Glassman, Dr. Jeffrey Glassman. Now, he published a paper in 1970 called the Glassman algorithm, which was an early iteration of the fast Fourier transform form. It's famous in the field, and it is about the fast Fourier transform form is a modelling technique for modelling chaotic dynamic systems. Jeffrey was a rocket scientist, and he's an expert on these things. Now, obviously, climate models come into this talk, and climate models use the same mathematics as the rest of us. I use this mathematics in sound modelling, for instance, in a technique known as convolution. The purpose of this slide was just to show how if you do a search for Greta on DuckAGoGo, you'll find that the wrong kind of green comes further up the search. And if you do it in Google, it doesn't come up at all, which is a point that stands on its own with no further sort of. This is one of this is the group which Greta resigned from. allegedly tried to cash in on her celebrity, and that's something that's been discussed in the Swedish press. The Local is the English for expatriates paper, which it's on there, and Greta actually explains why she resigned in her own Facebook post. This is the song Big Yellow Taxi by Joni Mitchell, which again is a wonderful song. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique and a swinging hotspot. It's a great song. They took all the trees, put them in a tree museum, and they charged the people $1.50 just to see them. You know, so it goes on. And the other song she wrote was Woodstock, in which we're informed that we're all golden, million-year-old carbon, and we've got to get back to the garden. So, you know, we're all on the same sides. Extinction Rebellion people, and Greta Thunberg, Green Party activists that reject the top-down turn under the Lucas regime and the Bartley and Berry regime. And then this is the Zeitgeist YouTube channel, and the Zeitgeist movement is about sustainability, and it's about a different way of doing money, a different way of doing political economy. I mean, you've got people like John Perkins down here, the Confessions of the Economic Hitman. There are some very interesting dialogues between Peter Joseph, who's the creator of the first Zeitgeist films, discussions with Alex Jones and with Stefan Molyneux. Peter is a fantastic guy. Oh, here he is. Look with Jimmy Dore. I haven't watched that one. I must have a look at that. But the reason I bring this out is to say, well, look, these came out in the late noughties, 2008, 9, something like that, and since then we've had the Occupy movement. Before that, there were the protests against the World Trade Organization rules and the GATT talks, the famous Seattle kick-off, if you like. There was a guy who turned out, I think, to be some sort of... There was some sort of scene going on between him and some undercover police people. He had quite a big YouTube channel back in the 2011 sort of time. Struggling to remember his name right now. But in the alternative media aristocracy, with people like Jones and Molyneux, Peter Joseph to a certain extent as well, I suppose, Jimmy Dore. I mean, I like Jimmy Dore. I mean, he had his start on the Young Turks with Senkunga, and this tension between them and say InfoWars. There's a lot of really good information that comes through these channels, including Stefan Molyneux. I mean, I don't follow Stefan Molyneux. I find him rather verbose. Here's me going on all the rest of Pot Kettle Black and all that, but the Zeitgeist movies are very, very good, well worth a watch. Or David Icke's talks as well. I find David Icke's analysis really rather good. But in terms of analysis and what have you, there's other analysis that I follow from people who I don't agree with politically. Mitch... there's an economics book by Mitch. I forget his name now, but anyway, as I say, I mean, you don't make progress with your own understanding of the world without listening to people who are not in agreement with you. It doesn't work. Otherwise you end up in an in-group echo chamber, and that's what these NGOs and these organised protest movements tend towards. They tend to indoctrinate and try to keep people within their tent, and that shuts down the bloom of knowledge. It's restrictive, censorious, and leads to magical thinking and belief systems which, if not challenged, can become rather obnoxious. And this is from my period of getting into what is knowable, belief on one hand, truth on the other, and where the overlap is knowledge, and it's the in philosophy it's what's known as the problem of knowledge. And I thought this was amusing, this cartoon where PewDiePie, the little chick there, thought that Tom from Tom and Jerry was its mother, and he kept trying to eat it, which is a kind of a metaphor for crony capitalism and on-message narratives, etc. Struck me as being rather amusing. So here we are, Greta's talk. Now on the talk, I'm a big fan of analysing the language used from transcripts, and TED are always very helpful in providing transcripts. This video is about communicating climate change or climate crisis. This woman here who wrote something called the Captain Kirk and Dr. Spock of Communicating Climate Change, and it was on Australian television. This chap here produces a program there, presents one. Robin something he's called, Robin Williams, and the transcript is helpfully provided there as well. And to contrast with that, this is the video of Dr. Glassman's talk with the slides on my YouTube channel. And on YouTube, if you click these three dots and say open transcript, Google Duplex, which is an artificial translation real-time thing, provides you with a transcript. And then a fourth thing in my little experiment here was this debate, I think it was in 2009, on the IQ2 platform, Intelligence Squared platform. It repays the watching. It's 1 hour 40 minutes long, and there's a transcript there too. And what I did is I did word clouds of the four of them, and this thing here is a thing called tag crowd. Now, the transcript of Jeffrey's slideshow from my thing is in there already, okay, and you've got parameters down here, so this is a game anyone can play, and you put your transcript in, I paste the text in, you can put the URL or whatever, or upload a file, and then you hit visualize, okay, with the parameters that you've got, and you get one of these. And it shows you the sort of language that's been used. Now, I've used this to analyse political debates and party political broadcasts, to find out what the on-message buzzwords are, if you like. This is a scientific talk, and it's got lots of scientific language. Conjecture, model, science, objective, scientific, peer, etc., gravity, prediction. You can tick a box which says show frequency, so you do that here, and you can actually, with the word frequencies, you know, if they have to appear more than 5 times or whatever, and that gets rid of things like names or descriptive things like the audience laughed. So, for instance, if you wanted to do this with a stand-up comic routine, you might want to sort of put laughter in that box down there. Otherwise, if it's a funny comic, that kind of will come up. So that's that there. So let's just do this now, and see what we can do is we can just grab all the text from this. This is fairly short. I won't do the other two, but there we are. So that's now copied. Okay, and go like that. Let's go back to the tag cloud generator, and we'll just get rid of Jeffrey's talk. So I'm doing this in real time without any notes, just with the tabs that I opened for things that I wanted to talk about. So do forgive me for this taking a couple of seconds. If we hit the back tab there now, and then I can paste that in there, and that's now Greta's talk. Okay, same parameters. If we hit visualize now, here we are. We've got emissions, crisis, climate, extinction. Now, facts are mentioned, but it's an assumption that there are facts, but doesn't speak to facts. It's an appeal to emotion, and it's a point that is actually aptly, this is a really long transcript, but it's aptly demonstrated in this. And if you watch the video and see what they're talking about with the communication of climate change, this is what they say. You know, if you get into the rational scientific side of things, most people don't process that kind of information, and so you need to stick to your talking points and well, really lay on the emotion with a trowel, which is that's the Captain Kirk side of things. You know, you don't put Dr. Spock in to rouse up a rabble, as it were. So let's just do this. Look. So if I say now copy that now, and the other thing I like doing this on is actually talks about economics, and they never talk about money, debt, or energy. So we get that one back there, and then we go like this, paste that in there. Same parameters down there, and if we hit visualize now, this is an hour-long television program about communicating climate change. And again, climate change, communication, happening, science, scientists, shepherd. Oh, that's a telling one. Shepherd, very interesting. Story, talking. Well, that makes a point. Now, I'm just going to finish this point off by getting this transcript now, which is a discussion and a debate, no less, about the science rather than the communication of the alleged crisis. So bear with me, I'll just highlight this. And voila. I'll copy that. And we'll do the same trick again here. Just get rid of that. I'll bung that in there. Here we go. Same parameters down below. And let's hit the visualize. And here we go. That's the thing I said about applause. Atmosphere, climate change, consensus. So in a debate about climate science, consensus, crisis, debate, global, Gavin is Gavin Schmidt, right, greenhouse, human, increase, warming, temperature, science, scientific, models, motion. That's Richard Lindzen, who's a leading climate scientist. But you can see the point that there are some more specific definable terms. Water appears 117 times. I don't know why it's not bigger. Or is that 17 times? 17 times. The point being, and Dr. Glassman makes this point, that a fact is something that's confirmable by measurement. And in science you have conjectures, theories. No, you have, was it conjectures, hypotheses, theories, and laws in science. And the thing you get into when you get into your Fourier transforms and your dynamic equations, etc. Boundary conditions are very, very important. You have to say within which parameters the prediction that you're making and testing are expected to hold true, and that's really, really important. And the predictions that you make have to be notable in some sense, something surprising about them, something which is non-trivial. And climate science has been trivialized by the sort of death cult of the alarm crisis side of things. Now, Greta in her talk talks about the circular economy, which is pretty important, very, very interesting field. The interview that she does in Davos, she complains about her parents don't even know what the Keeling curve is. Well, yep, quite right too. But in knowing about the Keeling curve, what you should also know is about outgassing of CO2 from the ocean in the equatorial Pacific, which happens downwind of Mauna Loa. It is screened out of the data, but if you know about it, you will know that carbon emissions from nature dwarf those of man's emissions from burning fossil fuels. That's just a straight out plain fact, and it's explained away in the IPCC rationalizations by that, well, those are natural emissions and they're part of a system which is in equilibrium, and therefore we're disrupting this individual and influencing one way or the other. And when you dig down into that, that turns out actually to be hokum. The environmental crisis, though, and the arguments for not burning fossil fuels, particularly in urban spaces where the particulates can be damaging, but to characterise CO2 as a pollutant is just nonsense. And when you get down into defining your terms and saying, right, so what is it we're looking at here? You know, if you were to define a pollutant or a pollution, what would that look like? And I contend it certainly wouldn't look like CO2. You could make a case for carbon monoxide because that can kill us. CO2 can't. But The reason carbon monoxide can kill us is when we breathe it in, it starves our brains of oxygen, because the one oxygen molecule in carbon monoxide combines with the oxygen, so it eats the oxygen. So instead of going to our brain, it basically gets ingested into the monoxide, and we die. And so you could argue that carbon monoxide is don't breathe in carbon monoxide, but carbon dioxide, which is already synthesized, that ain't gonna hurt you. What do we got here? This is a 1000 Frolly. This is what would be termed a denier channel. Now, there's lots of good stuff on here. Piers Corbyn, that's Jeremy Corbyn's brother. He's actually an astrophysicist and weather forecaster. Weather and climate are not the same thing. Piers makes his forecast based on space weather and activity on the sun, and he's very, very successful with it. And so people like Shaviv, I think he's at Tel Aviv University, and Svensmark in Copenhagen, they look at the effect of space weather on formation of clouds, and that there's a thing called the cloud experiment at CERN and what have you, and that's a field which has moved on and done, it's making some promising predictions, put it that way. So settled seance, indeed. What do we got here? Right, that's one of my songs. That's another one of my songs. Now this is the Extinction Rebellion talk page. I mean, if you read the article, this section here is the one I put in, sort of saying, we needed to look at the criticism and try and add something to the main page on that, so you can see the discussion on that, and make up your own mind. This was my first reasoned attempt. Greta Thunberg responded to concerns of corporate capture of her message, which has been expressed by the wrong kind of green and indigenous people's environmental group. Quote, "We attempt to expose those who undermine the people's agreement. One role of the non-profit industrial complex is to undermine, marginalise and make irrelevant the people's agreement. The reason being to protect corporate interests by which they are funded, as well as the non-profit industrial complex protects the industrialised capitalist economic system. Responsible for the capitalist destruction of our shared environment, these groups who continue to protect such interests must be considered complicit in crimes against humanity." Close quote. Now, I wasn't allowed to put that on because The Wrong Kind of Green is a blog and it's not a valid source for Wikipedia. My next attempt has been this one and those articles in the local, and Professor Piers Robinson, who's been smeared in Syria and talked about Wikipedia editing and stuff, and then I mentioned things like useful idiots, gatekeepers and controlled opposition and so forth, and so it's a question now of trying to get a non-controversial, balanced statement, which I've tried to do here with a quote, which is this at the end of Greta's Facebook post. "I was briefly a youth advisor for the board of the non-profit foundation We Don't Have Time. It turns out they use my name as part of another branch of their organisation that is a start-up business. They have admitted clearly that they did so without the knowledge of me or my family. I no longer have any connection to We Don't Have Time, nor has anyone in my family. They have deeply apologised and I've accepted their apology." And then if we just look at the article, it's what's something I found interesting here. If you look at the first open letter, it's signed by Molly Scott Cato, who's a Green Party MEP, member of the European Parliament, and by Sharar Ali, my old mate Sharar. And Sharar ran for the leadership of the Green Party. And if you look on, you can open his Wikipedia entry. If you look in the talk in it, you'll see me fighting his corner, saying, you know, it's absolutely ridiculous to accuse this man, who's a good man, of being an anti-Semite. Rupert Reed, I've mentioned him already. He's a signature. Then you've got Noam Chomsky down here, and he's become the sort of the poster boy, or the poster granddad, I suppose, of the Extinction Rebellion. I'll show you what I mean by that. Where are they? Let's have a look. Search up here. Extinction Rebellion. Let's see, here we are. Canada, Scotland. I'm not sure where their main page is, but I saw it earlier, and pinned to the top of it was a picture of Noam. And Noam is an intellectual hero of mine, but there are some points on which he sort of, oh no, well, here's another hero of mine, David Graeber. And so it's kind of like, would the gatekeepers please stand up and reveal themselves? David, he got involved with the anarchist movement in the northern part of Syria, the Kurds. Now, another good friend of mine was involved with the Kurdish struggle down there. Anyway, the CIA were obviously trying to get young people to join up as anarchists and go there and fight. And I was quite surprised to see David behind that, and he got all flustered on his Twitter page with me a year or two back about that. But he wrote a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which is brilliant. And he also wrote an essay about why John Kerry hadn't won against George Bush II in the second election that Bush won, in an article in something called The Commoner. And it's a brilliant article. The man's absolutely brilliant. He's involved in the Occupy movement and all the rest of it. Yeah, the idea of a climate crisis, I reject. I debate it with any of these people. I'm more than happy to have a public debate on the science. But as I say, I do wonder, apart from Noam, because Noam is a brilliant polymath, I've got to question whether David's maths is up to it. Well, Sharar's an engineer. He's got an engineering degree, so his maths ought to be up to it. And I can only presume that they haven't actually looked at it and don't know anything about about modelling dynamic systems. But be that as it may, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm very accustomed to being young, and I may be completely wrong about this. But as I say, from my understanding of the maths and the science, they're not home on that. So anyway, I wanted to make that point. So what else have we got here? Yeah, this is the smear on Piers Robinson. Let's talk about the World Socialist website. It's a good song. Should have played that when I went out for a cigarette, shouldn't I? So, here we are. This is a poem, or a part of a poem, by Alexander Pope, who wrote the famous essay on man, which I'm not going to read out. And then this is the blog that I did on Dr. Glassman's slides. As I say, if you watched this before this talk, I'm not going to go into all the stuff about modelling. I might do a video about that another day, on sound modelling, the fast Fourier transform, and how important it is to climate models, etc. You can watch Jeffrey's, listen to his talk and look at the slides. and there's nothing really I want to add to that. Manufacturing Consent, check it out. It's by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. On the Chomsky thing, check out the Corbett Report episode on Noam Chomsky being a gatekeeper. Gatekeepers, controlled opposition, useful idiots, that it's all part of, if you want to run a deep state or a secret, to keep people in line, this would be exactly as prescribed by Machiavelli in The Prince. Damon Ray Vable, check him out. I've put his video up on my BitChute channel, which talks about the money system and how it all plugs into the general system of control, and he talks about interest and whatnot. And it's those sides of this debate which is going to address the environmental destruction that's going on, and the marginalisation and dispossession of indigenous peoples. That's the enemy, not CO2. Now, big oil companies, greenwashing, fracking, not being as tidy as they might be, things like the big oil spill in the Gulf, or the Exxon Valdez oil tanker, all of that sort of thing. That all goes on, and it's all wrong, and we should rail against it. But the CO2 bit, the burning of it, the actual energy that we use to live at a level that provides us with the levels of comfort that we have, okay, that's perfectly supportable. What isn't supportable is this fraction of 1% and this increasing inequality, and the fact that the last few published surveys by Oxfam have showed these top billionaires having a bigger and bigger slice of all our pie, and that's the problem, and it stems from there. That's the root cause of the short-termism that we all suffer under. It really is as simple as that. So people like Helmut Cruz, Margaret Kennedy, Bernard Laitier, Paul Grignon, there are lots of people, Václav Smil, lots of people have written tomes of stuff on this stuff, and it's just a question, as David Icke says, of joining up the dots. But if you join up your political economy dots, if you join up your logic, statistical, mathematical, philosophical, ideological dots, the divide and conquer, the binary, setting up a binary adversarial debate, or it's not even debate, is it? It's just hate. That's where you'll find your answer. So more power to your elbow, Greta. Good luck with the protests tomorrow. Be safe. You'll find on my blog a booklet produced by Anonymous for being safe online and safe in situations of conflict with shall we say, the agent provocateur of crowd control. Your regular police, they're fantastic, but the black bloc and plainclothes undercover policemen causing problems to get people arrested and shut down legitimate protest is part of this big game which you find yourself in. So smile, love, hug each other, hug a policeman, hug a hoodie, and if you see the black bloc, tell them to sling their fucking hook, because they're not on your side. Chris Hedges wrote a very, very good article about the black bloc, got a lot of hassle for it. I'm an anarchist, they're not anarchists, they're part of the state apparatus of trying to screw it up for the rest of us, they're as anarchist as, well, I don't know really. I mean, whatever. I mean, it's they're not helping the situation and cause a lot of problems for people with a point to make legitimately. So the state has a monopoly on violence, and they have all the best weapons, just in the same way that the devil has all the best tunes. And Gandhi's way is the way to deal with it. You know, love will find a way. So peace, love, happiness and understanding, and that's all I've got to say today.